In the complex world of global economics, few words have sparked as much controversy as tariff. U.S. President Donald Trump said tariff
is the most beautiful word in the dictionary.
More beautiful than love. It's music to my ears.
While economists often view tariffs as a source of economic inefficiency, this divide isn't just academic. It's a battle that has shaped economies, sparked trade wars, and influenced the course of nations for centuries. The latest twist in this ongoing saga?
Whenever they tariff us, other countries, we will tariff them. That's reciprocal, back and forth.
How might this seemingly simple concept spark ripple effects in the complex landscape of macroeconomics? How does tariff influence economic competition between nations? What strategy is the most effective? In the end, do tariffs help or hurt a country? Let's fast forward to 2018 and cross the ocean to the United States. In a move that sent ripples through the global appliance industry, the U.S. imposed tariffs of 20% to 50% on imported washing machines. The official reason was to protect American brands like Whirlpool from fierce competition from overseas manufacturers like Samsung, LG, and Haier. But what actually happened when these tariffs were implemented? Not only did the price of imported washing machines go up, but domestic ones did too. The average cost of a washing machine jumped by about $86 per unit. Interestingly, even dryer prices increased by about $92 per unit, despite not being directly targeted by the tariffs. Why? Because consumers often buy washers and dryers as a set. The tariffs did create some jobs, about 1,800, mostly from foreign companies like Samsung and LG opening plants in the U.S. The U.S. government collected about $82 million annually from these tariffs. But here's the kicker. Because of the price increases, it cost consumers $1.5 billion more overall. When you do the math, it turns out that consumers were essentially paying $815,000 per job created. As one economist put it, this is a very expensive job creation program. There are much more cost-effective, more efficient ways of increasing employment in those industries. But wait, it gets even more interesting. A study by economists at the U.S. Federal Reserve found that the tariff elasticity of consumer prices was above 1. In plain English, this means that the price increases consumers faced were actually larger than the tariff itself. It's like if you added a 20% tax to something, but the price went up by more than 20%. Why did this happen? Well, it turns out that when you make imported goods more expensive, you're not just affecting those specific products. You're creating space for domestic producers to raise their prices too. After all, if the competition suddenly gets more expensive, why wouldn't you take advantage of that? Classical economists argue that tariffs create deadweight losses, a reduction in overall economic efficiency. Imagine a pie representing the total economic benefit. Tariffs, they say, make this pie smaller. But wait, there's a counter-argument called the infant industry theory. This suggests that new industries in a country might need temporary protection from international competition to grow and become competitive. In the 19th century, the United States and Germany used high tariffs to nurture their fledgling manufacturing industries. The U.S., for instance, imposed tariffs as high as 40% on manufactured goods in the late 1800s, helping to fuel its rapid industrialization. More recently, China imposed massive tariffs on imported cars, helping its domestic auto industry grow from infancy to a global powerhouse. In the early 2000s, China's tariffs on imported cars were as high as 100%, giving domestic manufacturers like Geely and BYD time to develop their capabilities. India's Make in India initiative includes tariffs as part of its strategy to boost domestic manufacturing. For example, in 2020, India increased tariffs on a range of products, including furniture, toys, and footwear, to encourage local production. So, are tariffs good or bad? As with many things in economics, the answer is, it depends. Beyond their economic impacts, tariffs often serve as powerful political tools. They can be used as bargaining chips in negotiations, threats to force concessions, or retaliatory measures in trade disputes. And now, we're seeing the emergence of a new weapon in the tariff arsenal: reciprocal tariffs. Reciprocal tariffs are exactly what they sound like: a tit-for-tat approach to trade policy. The idea is simple. Whatever tariff rate another country charges on U.S. goods, the U.S. will charge the same rate on their goods. It's a policy that's been championed by President Trump, who famously said, "Whatever they tariff us, other countries, we will tariff them." That's reciprocal, back and forth. On the surface, it might sound fair. After all, why should other countries be able to charge high tariffs on U.S. goods if the U.S. isn't doing the same? But as with most things in economics, the reality is far more complex. Economists warn that reciprocal tariffs could have far-reaching consequences, potentially affecting more industries and consumers than traditional tariff policies. To understand how tariffs can spiral out of control, let's look at one of the most fascinating examples of tariffs as political weapons, the so-called Chicken War of the 1960s. This trade dispute between the United States and Europe is a perfect illustration of how tariffs in one industry can have unexpected consequences in another. In the 1960s, the U.S. poultry industry was experiencing a revolution. Thanks to industrial farming techniques, American chicken farmers were producing birds faster and cheaper than ever before. With more chicken than Americans could eat, farmers started exporting their surplus to Europe, particularly to West Germany. European chicken farmers, unable to compete with the cheap American imports, pressured their governments to take action. In 1962, the European Economic Community, the precursor to the EU, imposed a tariff on imported chicken. In 1963, President Lyndon B. Johnson responded by imposing a 25% tariff on potato starch, dextrin, brandy, and light trucks. While most of these tariffs were eventually lifted, the 25% tariff on light trucks persists to this day, profoundly shaping the American auto industry. This chicken war demonstrates how a dispute over one product can lead to long-lasting tariffs on seemingly unrelated goods. More recently, the ongoing trade tensions between the U.S. and China involved multiple rounds of tariff impositions and counter-impositions, affecting industries from agriculture to technology. The trade war began in 2018, when the U.S. imposed tariffs on $34 billion worth of Chinese goods, citing unfair trade practices. China quickly retaliated with tariffs on an equal amount of U.S. goods. The conflict escalated over the next 2 years, with both sides imposing tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of each other's products. The impacts were far-reaching. U.S. farmers saw exports to China plummet, requiring government subsidies to offset losses. American companies manufacturing in China faced increased costs and supply chain disruptions. Chinese tech companies like Huawei were cut off from American suppliers, forcing them to seek alternatives. Global economic growth slowed as uncertainty rattled markets and dampened business investment. But here's where it gets really interesting. Even with all these economic downsides, a review by the Biden administration suggested that Trump's tariffs should remain in place, and they even added or increased some. Why? Well, as one expert put it, once tariffs get in place, there are two factors that sort of keep them in place for some time. First of all, there are going to be domestic interest groups that have a stake in seeing those tariffs maintained, because they like the extra market share that they've gained as a result of those tariffs. And second of all, tariffs are a bargaining chip. So why would we sort of unilaterally get rid of these, even if there are some economic benefits, when we might use them in some negotiations down the road? This ongoing dispute highlights how tariffs, when used as political weapons, can have wide-ranging economic consequences. One common argument for imposing tariffs is to reduce trade deficits. The logic seems straightforward. Make imports more expensive, and people will buy fewer foreign goods, thus reducing the trade deficit. However, the reality is far more complex. Short-term effects might indeed reduce imports, but long-term impacts are less certain due to factors like exchange rates and global demand shifts. Retaliatory tariffs from trading partners can reduce exports, potentially negating any benefits. In our interconnected global economy, tariffs can disrupt supply chains, harming domestic industries that rely on imported components. For example, when the U.S. imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum imports in 2018, it was partly aimed at reducing the trade deficit. However, the results were mixed. The overall U.S. trade deficit actually increased in the following years. While imports of steel and aluminum decreased, retaliatory tariffs from other countries hurt U.S. exports in sectors like agriculture. Moreover, when tariffs reduce imports, they can have an unexpected effect on exports too. Here's how it works. As imports decrease, there are fewer dollars in foreign markets. This drives up the dollar's value, making American exports more expensive for trade partners. As a result, they buy fewer American goods, and both imports and exports end up decreasing, often leaving the trade deficit unchanged. The U.S. 25% tariff on steel imports to protect the domestic steel industry and boost national security, because you need steel to build tanks and ships and whatnot. Sounds good on paper, right? Well, not so fast. Steel isn't just a final product, it's a crucial input for countless other industries. Think about it. Cars, construction, machinery, they all need steel. So when the price of steel goes up, it doesn't just affect steel producers. It ripples through the entire economy. Yes, the U.S. steel industry did see some benefits. Employment in steel production increased slightly. The price of steel in the U.S. rose significantly, making it more expensive for American companies to buy this essential material. And this is where it gets really interesting. All those industries that use steel as an input, they got hit hard. Auto manufacturers, construction companies, and machinery producers all saw their costs go up. Here's the kicker. Studies found that for each job created in the steel industry, multiple jobs were lost in these downstream industries that use steel. The overall effect? A net reduction in manufacturing employment. That's right. A policy aimed at protecting American jobs ended up costing more jobs than it created. Why did this happen? Well, it turns out there are way more industries in the U.S. that use steel than produce it. So while the tariffs helped a relatively small group of steel producers, they hurt a much larger group of steel users. It's a classic case of unintended consequences. This steel tariff case really drives home a crucial point. In our modern, interconnected economy, no industry exists in isolation. Now, let's look at a tariff that's been around for a while. Way back in 1964, the U.S. slapped a 25% tariff on imported light trucks. Why? Well, it's actually a pretty funny story involving a trade war over chickens. Yes, really, we just talked about it, remember? The important thing is that this tariff has been in place for nearly 60 years. So what can we learn from it? Protection works, sort of. This tariff did exactly what it was supposed to do. It protected U.S. automakers from foreign competition in the light truck and SUV market. These vehicles became huge profit centers for companies like General Motors and Ford. Interestingly, the tariff also encouraged foreign automakers to set up shop in the U.S. Companies like Toyota, Honda, and BMW built assembly plants in America, creating thousands of jobs. But here's the downside. With essentially only 3 major companies supplying the U.S. light truck market, there was less pressure to innovate and improve efficiency. Less competition often means less motivation to make better products. And the American consumers have likely been paying higher prices for trucks and SUVs than they would in a more competitive market. Even today, decades later, the U.S. truck and SUV market isn't as fiercely competitive as it could be. This tariff, intended as a temporary measure, has had long-lasting effects on the industry. It's a reminder that when we talk about tariffs, we're not just talking about short-term economic impacts. We're potentially shaping entire industries for generations to come. Now, you might be thinking, surely if we put tariffs on imports, companies will have to bring production back to the U.S., right? Well, not so fast. Companies are pretty creative when it comes to avoiding extra costs, and tariffs are no exception. Back in 2006, Mercedes-Benz came up with a clever workaround for that 25% light truck tariff we just talked about. They would manufacture their vans in Germany, completely disassemble them like a giant automotive IKEA kit, ship the parts to South Carolina, and then reassemble them there. Voila, no tariff. It was less efficient, sure, but cheaper than paying the tariff. When the U.S. imposed tariffs on Chinese goods in 2018, many companies didn't move production to the U.S. Instead, they just shifted to other countries like Vietnam or Mexico, where the tariffs didn't apply. Some companies avoid tariffs by shipping products to a third country, where they're relabeled and repackaged before being sent to their final destination. It's a bit like laundering goods instead of money. Sometimes, companies will try to reclassify their products to fit into a category with lower tariffs. Is it a truck or a passenger vehicle? The difference could mean millions in tariffs. These workarounds highlight a crucial point. Tariffs don't always work the way policymakers intend. Companies will often go to great lengths to avoid tariffs before they'll consider the often more costly option of relocating their entire manufacturing operation. Today, tariffs are at the center of heated economic and political debates. But how did this actually come about? Picture this. It's 1789. And the newly formed United States of America has just ratified its Constitution. What's the second piece of legislation they pass? A Tariff Act. That's right, tariffs have been part of America's economic DNA since day one. The mastermind behind this early tariff policy was none other than Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton had read Adam Smith's groundbreaking ideas about free trade and the invisible hand of the market. But he looked at the fledgling American economy and thought, nah, that's not gonna work for us. Not yet anyway. America needed its economic independence. The problem was, Europe had a head start. They were already knee-deep in their industrial revolution, churning out steel, textiles, and machinery at prices American producers couldn't match. So Hamilton's solution? Slap tariffs on those European imports. Make them more expensive, and suddenly, setting up shop on American soil starts to look a lot more attractive to entrepreneurs. It was a bold move, and it set the stage for nearly a century of American trade policy. Fast forward to the late 19th century, and U.S. tariffs on targeted goods were sitting pretty at over 40%. And you know what? It worked. American industries were booming. In fact, tariffs were such a cash cow for the government that they made up 90% of federal income. Income tax? That wasn't even a thing until 1910. European countries, miffed about those high U.S. tariffs, were retaliating by slapping their own tariffs on exports like cotton and tobacco. After World War II, though, everything changed. The U.S., now an industrial powerhouse with most of its global competitors in ruins, did a complete 180. Suddenly, it was all about free trade. This shift culminated in 1995 with the creation of the World Trade Organization, WTO, which has been working to lower tariffs and trade barriers ever since. The WTO provides a forum for negotiating trade agreements and resolving disputes. However, its effectiveness has been questioned in recent years, particularly as major powers like the U.S. have bypassed its processes. The ongoing dispute over subsidies to aircraft manufacturers. Boeing and Airbus illustrates both the WTO's role and its limitations. It's worth noting that the WTO operates under a principle of non-discrimination. This means that, with few exceptions, WTO members must offer the same tariff rates to all other members. This principle, known as most favored nation treatment, is a cornerstone of the global trading system. However, the concept of reciprocal tariffs could potentially conflict with this principle, creating challenges for the WTO in the broader international trading system. Regional trade agreements like the European Union, NAFTA, now USMCA, and the African Continental Free Trade Area create zones of reduced or eliminated tariffs among member countries. These agreements can significantly shape trade patterns and economic integration. As we look to the future, several factors are reshaping the tariff debate. As manufacturing becomes increasingly automated, will tariffs be as effective in protecting jobs? How will emerging technologies like 3D printing impact traditional trade patterns and policies? Reciprocal tariffs could lead to a significant reshuffling of global trade patterns. Some experts worry that it could trigger a global race to raise tariffs, potentially undoing decades of trade liberalization. Others speculate that it might push other countries to band together, potentially isolating the U.S. in the global trading system. In the end, tariffs remain a powerful but controversial tool. Policymakers, economists, and citizens alike must grapple with the impacts brought by tariffs. Many economists worry that the current trend towards increased tariffs could worsen inflation and potentially lead to a recession. So the next time you hear the word tariff in the news, remember, behind that simple word lies a complex world of economic theory, political maneuvering, and global consequences. It may not be the most beautiful word in the dictionary, but it's certainly a dangerous one, as it is like a double-edged sword.